some of what I'm going to say is going to be familiar from Magdalena's talk, but I'll be coming from the other direction. I'm going to be looking at healthy people and how they forget in order to feel better about themselves. So generally we think it's good to remember. Memory serves the purpose of providing us with an accurate record of past events and general facts. If we didn't have a good memory of what's happened to us, then we wouldn't really have much information about the world at all. Like how to get here, we need our memory. How to recognize our family, we need our memory. So memory plays an awfully big role in our lives. And when we start forgetting or misremembering, that can be scary and make us feel out of control. You may be familiar with that when you're particularly stressed and start forgetting things. You also start feeling that you're not in control of your life anymore, and you don't know what's going to happen next. However, inaccurate memories and selective forgettings can also have positive effects on our well-being. So they can leave us with the view of ourselves and the world which is more coherent and more flattering. So there seems to be, at least in terms of how we feel about ourselves, a tendency for us to remember selectively, which means we forget certain things, or falsely, which means we remember things that didn't actually happen in a way that makes us feel better. And I'll give you some examples, but first I'll walk you through the plan for this short talk. So, first of all, I'm going to tell you how selective and distorted memory fosters a coherent view of our past and the world, and a positive self-image. Then we're going to look at the way these two factors interact by looking at an example, that of failing or failed relationships. Then we're going to take stock and consider the question when and why distorted memories are harmful, and then we're going to think about whether there's anything we can do about that. So, first thing, creating coherence. I'll read you a quote. False memories, far from being damaging to the individual, can often be of considerable benefit, particularly in maintaining a coherent, confident, and positive self. Remembering is a constructive process which helps us make sense of past events and ourselves. So two biases that we have illustrate this. There's the consistency bias and the hindsight bias. I'll quickly tell you about the hindsight bias because you might be familiar with it from your own lives. So once we know what the outcome of a situation is, we tend to remember the things that support that outcome, that made that outcome more likely, and forget the things that made that outcome seem less likely before it actually occurred. And there's some nice experiments where people have tested that. They gave people a story of a couple who's just met, and then one half of the group got an ending to the story where the couple ends up marrying, and the other group got an ending where the couple ends up with the woman getting raped. Not very nice, but in terms of what then happened when they tested for memories of the story, what happened is that people, first of all, thought that they were quite likely to know what was going to happen, but also that they remembered supporting evidence for whatever ending they were then faced with, even though they heard the same story up to the point where they got different endings. So people will make up, maybe that's a bit strong, but remember things that support what the eventual outcome was. Okay, now we're going to look at how we use memory to protect and enhance the self. So we remember positive feedback and we forget negative feedback. And there was another experiment which illustrates that quite well, where people did a personality test. It was a bogus personality test. And then they were told, okay, now we're going to give you some predictions about either your own future behavior or the future behavior of a hypothetical other person called Chris. And what happened is that the people who did these studies were much more likely to remember the positive things that were predicted for themselves and to forget the negative things that were predicted for themselves than they were for Chris. So they didn't feel the need to protect Chris's image, but they did selectively remember the information about themselves. So it looks like we remember and forget in such a way that we feel better about ourselves. And there's some other ways which we frequently use to do this. So you'd think that we always remember the positive about ourselves. That was what the last example was about. But sometimes it works the other way around. So sometimes people remember the negative in order to feel better about their present self. So one example is that people inflate their nervousness before an exam to make their achievement look more impressive. So maybe I might say, I was so nervous before this talk, before it started, I was shivering everything, and then I'll feel, provided that it went well, much better about the result than I would otherwise have. And you also get this with more general character traits that people say, well, I've got much kinder or more perceptive over the years. So comparing themselves to their prior selves, they have done very well. Now we're going to move into how coherence and feeling better about yourself interact when we have cognitive dissonance, rejection, and self-justification. So what's cognitive dissonance? It's the feeling of discomfort that arises when we hold two contradictory beliefs. These could be any two contradictory beliefs, but the most famous cognitive dissonance cases tend to be the ones where our self-image is threatened. So, one obvious example for that is the breakup of a relationship. How is our self-image threatened when our relationship breaks up? When we face the following challenge, I need to assimilate the idea that ending the relationship is the right thing to do without endangering my self-image as a fundamentally good and lovable person. And that can go in different ways, right? You might be the person who's being left, in which case you kind of need to find a way of feeling good about yourself even though somebody's just rejected you, which you might take as a sign that you're not that lovable. But also, if you are the person who's doing the leaving, you're also going to have some cognitive dissonance that you need to reduce, because most of us will have invested in a relationship over years, and now you decide this needs to come to an end, and you're causing the person that you were attached to for such a long time pain. So you're going to have to find some way of justifying that. And you see that all the time. I mean, you see it in yourselves, and you see it in your friends and family. So what people often do is they talk down the quality of the relationship or of the partner, and they say things like, it could never have worked out, or it wasn't meant to be. He never really loved me. He never really listened to me. You can add your own examples. And there's a book called Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me, and I took this nice quote for you. Thanks to the revisionist power of memory to justify our decisions, by the time many couples divorce, they can't remember why they married. It's as if they had a non-surgical lobotomy that excised the happy memories of how each partner once felt towards the other. So we have selective remembering and distorted remembering by the person who is breaking up, actually normally by both persons who are breaking up. And this is often done with the active assistance of friends and relatives. And this is actually quite interesting, because remember when I was talking about the coherence biases? So the coherence bias would kick in there as well. So if I have a friend and they're breaking up, then I'm trying to make sense of that situation as well. So I will also try to enlist evidence as to why this situation now makes sense. So in a way, this is a collaborative exercise. Okay, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, there's clear short-term benefits in terms of coping and coming to terms with the situation. And you can see that when people are in the throes of a recent breakup, people try to actually, friends and family try to maybe muster the anger or activate the anger of these people in order for them to not fall into despair. And the other thing is, also in a more long-term perspective, we end up with life stories that subjectively make more sense. We don't have this huge period of our life which doesn't quite add up, because we started with high hopes and with a lot of investment, and then at some point it just didn't work anymore. So there are benefits, but there are also costs. What are the costs? Self-justification and distorted memories can doom a relationship that was still salvageable. So often this process of justification starts while you're still in the relationship, right? Because there's conflict and you have to decide how to react to the conflict. And one way of doing that is by saying, I'm right, and this person who's not happy with me is wrong, and recruiting the memories and stories that support that position. But even, let's say the situation wasn't salvageable, it's not just our past that we rewrite when we rewrite our past after a breakdown. There's other people involved. There's children, there's in-laws, and I think especially in the case of children, it may be very painful for the children if you are then going to put a very negative spin on that relationship, because that was a huge part of their life as well. Depends on how long the marriage lasted. And then the last point, which isn't on here because I for some reason forgot to put it on, and it only occurred to me on the way here, obviously, if we understand what's going on and don't just self-justify, we have a better chance of learning for the future. And nobody quite knows how much we can learn from the future from past experience, but if we don't acknowledge past experience, we're definitely not going to learn for the future. Now, you might say that's all well and good, so we've got some reasons why it's not such a great idea to self-enhance or self-justify and remember selectively. But is there actually anything we can do about this? Because otherwise it might just be an academic question where you say, well, this is a bad thing, but it's just the way we are made, and so we just have to deal with it. And one thing to say, I've talked about recruiting memories and enlisting memories, but memories are not something we consciously choose to have. They're like beliefs in that way. They come to us, but we do have control over what we choose to recall and what not. So I can't decide, I can't look at a memory and say, okay, I'm not going to remember that anymore. It doesn't work like that in that conscious way, and we all know that. But what I can do is I can say, well, let's sit down and try and remember some of the positive things that happened in that relationship. And maybe I can ask some of my friends to assist me. And the other way, and I think this is a very important way we can have some indirect control, is through the extent in which we self-justify. Because once you start telling a story in order to say, this is why I'm right and the other person's wrong, then of course you're also going to start trying to find ways of making that story make more sense to yourself. If you're not telling that story to begin with, then you're not going to have the need to recruit those memories. And I realize this is kind of extremely idealized. These are emotional situations. We will all do some self-justification and some that will affect our memories. But it's not like this is a one-off thing. It's going to be a process that goes through your whole life. And it might be that we're better off psychologically if we are more distorted right after a relationship has come to an end, but try to regain some perspective over time. So here's my conclusion. Distorted and selective remembering has clear benefits for our self-image and well-being, so it makes us feel better, it makes the world seem more coherent, and it makes us seem like nicer people. However, it's not without costs, and we should look at how high these costs are, and where they are high, we should strive to minimize them. Thank you very much.